The member from London West.
I'm pleased to rise today on behalf of the people I represent in London West to add my voice to the debate on time allocation on Bill 7, the bill that is optimistically called by the Liberals the Better Business Climate Act. I was looking forward to participating in the debate on the contents of the bill itself, but the government has chosen to introduce a closure motion to cut off debate and move the bill quickly to committee so that it can be passed. Speaker, it will come as no surprise to members of this legislature that my New Democratic colleagues and I are opposed to the time allocation motion. We are opposed on philosophical grounds because closure stifles democracy. It silences the voices of the 13 million Ontarians who are represented by MPPs in this chamber from all three political parties. Closure is a blunt instrument. If used, it must be used sparingly and only in circumstances that warrant its use. But the government has not put forward any compelling rationale for the need to move this bill through. They have not offered anything to back up the urgency of this legislation. They have not presented any kind of argument that justifies shutting down debate, that says there is a higher public policy good that will be achieved if this bill is passed now. Something so important that it is okay to override the right of MPPs to speak on behalf of their communities, to talk about what this legislation will mean to the people we represent. That's because the government knows that there is nothing in this legislation that allows them to make this claim. Despite its very hopeful title, it is an innocuous PR exercise that contributes almost nothing to getting our economy moving, to creating good jobs, and to addressing the real challenges people face. Like so many other bills that we have seen since the election of this Liberal majority government, Bill 7 brings together two different and barely related pieces of legislation that were previously introduced and repackages them under a shiny new title. Schedule 1 of Bill 7, an act to enact the Burden Reduction Reporting Act, requires the minister to report annually on actions taken by the government to reduce regulatory burdens. Schedule 2, the Partnerships for Jobs and Growth Act, allows the minister to create plans to develop clusters and to consult with those interested in the cluster before the plans are finalized. Looking at the first part of the bill, what's important to point out is that there is nothing in Schedule 1 that actually contributes to reducing red tape, defined as the statutory, regulatory, procedural, administrative, or other requirements that create costs to business in terms of money, time, or resources, and unnecessarily inhibit productivity, job creation, and innovation. Bill 7 only commits the government to publishing an annual report on what the government has done, if anything, to reduce regulatory burdens. And while it clearly makes the Minister of Economic Development, Employment and Infrastructure responsible for reporting on how the government is reducing burdens, it is silent on the process that decides what constitutes a burden and which burdens should be reduced. New Democrats fully support streamlining regulatory processes to make it easier for entrepreneurs to start up new businesses and to make it easier for established businesses to grow and expand. But we also believe that strong regulatory frameworks are critical in areas like environmental protection, for example, and worker health and safety. Because there may be environmental regulations or health and safety regulations that are perceived by some businesses as burdensome, but they are absolutely critical to ensure clean air and clean water and to protect worker safety. New Democrats have a concern that Bill 7 could implicitly condone the elimination of regulatory protections that are essential to safeguard the public interest, all in the name of cutting red tape. That said, however, we certainly agree with the importance of removing unnecessary regulatory burdens for Ontario businesses. particularly when it comes to bringing those who have been shut out of the labour market back into the economy by giving them equal opportunities to start up and operate businesses. Right now, the OECD is leading a study on inclusive entrepreneurship to identify the policies and best practices that contribute to the social inclusion of youth, women, seniors, newcomers, visible minorities, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and other groups who are disadvantaged and underrepresented in business creation and self-employment. There is a terrific report that came out of that study just last year called The Missing Entrepreneurs: Policies for Inclusive Entrepreneurship in Europe, which identifies some specific regulatory barriers that impact entrepreneurship and self-employment among disadvantaged and underrepresented groups and prevent access to key resources. These include tax, family and social policies that tacitly encourage traditional roles for women, age rules for participation in business activity, and the complexity of regulations that are difficult for young people to navigate, retirement policies that create disincentives for seniors to earn additional income, foreign credential recognition and Canadian experience requirements that create barriers for immigrants to get into the economy, social policies that put a cap on self-employment earnings for people with disabilities who are receiving disability benefits. So if and when the government takes steps to reduce the regulatory burden, and when it presents its report on the steps that were taken, New Democrats will be looking at whether the barriers that prevent young people and immigrants and people with disabilities and First Nations and other disadvantaged groups from starting their own businesses, whether these barriers are being addressed, and whether the reduction of red tape is facilitating inclusive entrepreneurship for all potential business owners in this province. It's also important to point out that the government doesn't even need Bill 7 in order to change unnecessary regulations. It could go ahead and do that today. And it certainly doesn't need legislation in order to publish a report about what it is doing to change unnecessary regulations. If the government was serious about creating a better business climate, then it would do much more than publish a report once a year. I want to share with this House some of the barriers to self-employment and business ownership that were identified in my community just last month when the London Small Business Centre reported on its Entrepreneurship Climate Survey that was conducted in Middlesex, Elgin, Oxford and Lambton. About 1,500 people were interviewed by telephone and were classified according to whether they owned or had owned a small business or were seriously considering starting their own business. About 15% said that they currently owned a small business, 14% used to own a small business, and 12% intended to start a small business. When asked about barriers to business ownership, by far the most significant barrier for all respondents was insufficient financial resources, especially for those who were intending to start a business. Other barriers that hold people back from business ownership are fear of failure and lack of a solid business plan, as well as insufficient knowledge or skills in the selected business and family commitments. This suggests that access to funding, mentorship programs, tailored post-secondary education and training programs, affordable childcare or adult day programs for seniors, these are some of the critical elements that are necessary to improve the business climate in this province and enable businesses to thrive. I now want to turn to Schedule 2 of the bill, which deals with clusters. That is, geographically interconnected firms and supporting institutions within a particular industry sector. There is an emerging policy consensus about the effectiveness of clusters in stimulating job creation, entrepreneurship and innovation. So it's great to see that this government is talking about cluster strategies. The problem is that this legislation won't do a thing to facilitate cluster development in Ontario. There is no regulatory framework in Bill 7, no dollars to support cluster initiatives, no incentives to bring firms together in a cluster strategy, and no resources to spark cluster innovation through regional networking. When the NDP government launched its Sector Partnership Fund back in 1992, it provided funding of up to $500,000 per sector to support the formation of a sector strategy. Even the PC government recognized the importance of financial support and provided up to $200,000 for the development of regional biotechnology cluster plans in 2002. Some of the leading edge research coming out of the U.S. on clusters from the Brookings Institute and elsewhere emphasizes the importance of planning grants to support cluster development. Grants that can fund feasibility studies by regional consortia like the RICS, or industry collaborations or post-secondary institutions. But what does this Liberal government include in their cluster initiative? Nothing, not a cent, which makes one wonder why they even bothered with this legislation if they weren't prepared to commit resources toward the development of cluster plans. In my community in London, where almost 30,000 jobs have been lost since 2008, there is also a concern about whether cluster strategies can address the needs of those who have been left behind by the collapse of the manufacturing sector and the transition to a new economy. Clusters tend to be associated with high-skill, high-wage jobs in fields like biotech and ICT, which often bypass economically and socially disadvantaged groups who are struggling just to put food on the table. As a result, cluster strategies have been critiqued for skewing resources to those who are already better off, instead of supporting just and equitable economic development for all. But similar to the new focus on inclusive entrepreneurship that I mentioned earlier, there is also growing interest in inclusive cluster development. In particular, cluster development that meets the triple bottom line of increased competitiveness, economic opportunity for unemployed and disadvantaged workers, and environmental sustainability. To be inclusive, efforts must be made during the cluster selection phase to bring in people, places, and firms that may be outside the economic mainstream. And clusters must be identified and nurtured across all regions of this province, not just in the established hotspots. This is not to say that clusters can be artificially created where they do not authentically exist. There has to be evidence of co-located and interconnected firms working with the same supporting organizations. For example, in my community in London, an exciting digital creative cluster has taken shape, supported by local economic development efforts, Fanshawe College and Western University, Tech Alliance, and some internationally recognized anchor firms. Incubator space is available downtown at Hacker Studios, Inner Geek Studios, and London, as well as the MPP Lab at Western Research Park. And the Southwestern Ontario Angel Group is ready to provide that needed early-stage investment. The cluster now employs about 8,000 people, but could employ many more. A cluster plan with funding attached could help that digital creatives cluster grow and expand by supporting things like training, R&D, technology transfer and adoption, and marketing. To ensure equitable access to economic opportunity, cluster strategies must involve all the partners within the local region, including government, secondary and post-secondary education, training, economic development, labour and civic organizations. And they must include a specific focus on the workforce development needs of the industry within the local labour market. Absolutely essential to identifying workforce development needs is data, reliable, timely, and granular data, which continues to be a gaping hole in our knowledge of local labour markets. In fact, cluster experts emphasize that each phase of cluster development, from the initial identification of clusters to the range of policy interventions to the measurement of cluster effectiveness, must be grounded in rigorous empirical evidence and analysis. This is another area where the government could show leadership by funding workforce planning boards to develop robust data collection and sharing capacities to inform cluster development strategies. In my community, the Elgin-Middlesex-Oxford Workforce Planning and Development Board has operated on a shoestring budget to develop an amazing local resource called worktrends.ca, which offers one-stop access to rich information about the local labour market. As more and more community partners recognize that our local and regional prosperity depends on cross-sector collaboration and information sharing, this tool is only beginning to scratch the surface of its full potential. It is a model that could and should be replicated in communities across the province, a model that would be even more powerful if the government dedicated real resources to its continued enhancement, and if the government allocated resources to enable other local training boards to implement similar initiatives. Worktrends.ca offers an important asset to assist in identifying areas of true competitive advantage within the region, to assist in identifying the existing skills that are already available in our local labour market, and also to identify the talent pool that is being generated by our local post-secondary institutions. I want to close with a word of warning from the cluster experts I mentioned earlier. Cluster policy cannot be top-down. It must be driven locally. It must flow from the on-the-ground networks, experiences, and resources that are already in place. It must leverage the work that is already being done by local actors, like the London Economic Development Corporation in my community, which has identified the key clusters that are ready for provincial innovation support, like food and beverage processing, which employs over 6,000 people in the London area, life sciences, which employs over 21,000 people, advanced manufacturing with a focus on automotive, clean tech, and defence, which employs over 30,000 people, in addition to the digital creative cluster that I talked about earlier. The notion described in Bill 7 of the minister deciding to prepare a cluster plan and then consulting with persons or entities with an interest in the cluster is hugely problematic, and it flies in the face of best practice and research from around the world. So, in closing, Speaker, New Democrats will be opposing the time allocation motion. We think that there should be much greater opportunity for MPPs on all sides of this House to talk about this bill, to talk about what this legislation means to the people we represent, what it brings or doesn't bring to our community and our local efforts to get our economies moving. However, we will be supporting the bill. Not because we think that it will do anything really to improve the business climate in Ontario, despite its very eloquent and optimistic and hopeful title, the Better Business Climate Act, but we think it basically does nothing. It is an innocuous PR exercise that really doesn't contribute anything to getting the economy moving, and it's really not worth opposing. So, thank you, Speaker.